we have the incredible opportunity we had, and we are glad we were successful, to have with us a man who speaks about the unique challenges of women in the most challenging regions of the world. You know, I really liked reading his column before he started writing about women, but now after he started writing about women, I love him. So it's my pleasure to introduce two-time Pulitzer Prize winner and New York Times columnist, Mr. Nicholas Kristof. Not yet. I want to say a couple of things about you, Mr. Kristof. He brings readers of his column and his books like Half the Sky first-hand insights into the lives of women and men from around the world. His writing, his passion and advocacy illuminate issues of poverty, global health, and human rights. To me, one of the most amazing things about him is his wisdom in his writing and his voice. And I want to give you just a very quick example. I recently read an op-ed by him addressing the discrepancy about the authenticity of the book 3 Cups of Tea by Greg Mortenson and the physical management of Mr. Mortenson nonprofit. And I was very important that I read that and I really digested because he was our speaker last year at graduation. And for those of you who have not read that book, Mr. Greg Mortenson discusses his efforts to build schools in Pakistan and Afghanistan after a failed attempt to climb the world's second highest mountain, K2. In his recent op-ed, Mr. Kristof doesn't adopt the sensational tones that have filled up the media about Mr. Mortenson. He reminds us that there might be some things that need to be looked at, but we should never forget that every little effort that's made to educate girls has major impact on societies, and we shouldn't be throwing everything Mr. Mortenson have done just because of the few allegations. I was just really touched by that voice of wisdom and voice of reason, which really characterizes everything he writes. He's traveled to more than 140 countries, including multiple visits to hotspots such as Iraq, Iran, North Korea, and most recently, Somalia, looking at drought and maternal mortality rates. And he traveled to Egypt to also find out where the women are in Tahrir Square. He shares the stories of those he meets to inform and inspire all of us in his writing. I think that was a turning point when New York Times had a special column related to women. Today, we are absolutely thrilled to have him right here in New York, not somewhere else in the world, to share his observations, insights, and stories about women in urban areas. Let's put our forks down, our knives down, and give him a real warm welcome.
Thank you so much. That was really nice. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. I understand it's gone very well this morning. I'm just back from Somalia, and I'm sure everybody who has come here has said how happy they are to be here. Well, considering that a couple of days ago I was in Somalia, headed to the airport, and my security car full of gunmen, their car broke down. So considering the alternatives, boy, I'm glad to be here. And I'm especially glad to be here because I think that the mission of the conference and of the center is going to be so important. I, of course, believe that the central moral challenge for this century does involve the role of women. And the truth is that increasingly women are urbanized. And so the challenge is how to meet those needs in an urban setting. There isn't enough that we know about that. And so you're helping to address that. And I really welcome that research that is going to come out of the work you do. People are always a little bit surprised that a New York Times columnist, and a man to boot, should be writing so much about some of these kinds of issues. And let me explain a little bit how that came about. It really arose from my travels, and in particular, some of the encounters that I had as a reporter. And I think one that was kind of an epiphany for me was in Cambodia in the mid-1990s or so. I was writing about teenage prostitution. I went into a brothel in the Tulkork district of Phnom Penh and spent an afternoon interviewing two girls who had been locked up inside that brothel. One was 15, one had been sold at 14 by her stepfather, and the other had been kidnapped by a neighbor at 15 and sold to that brothel. And they were locked up there. If they had tried to run away, they would have been seized by the police and sent right back. And maybe what really shook me the most was that the 15-year-old told me that when she went missing, when she was kidnapped, her mother began searching all over Cambodia to try to find her. In Cambodia, if your teenage daughter goes missing, the place you look is the red light districts. Well, after months of searching, the mother went into that red light district and into that brothel, and they had this joyous reunion. And in my naivete, I asked, well, then why didn't your mother take you away? And the girl said something that just seared me. She said, the brothel owner, who was a woman, that the brothel owner said that she'd paid good money for me. My mother would have to buy me back. My mother didn't have the money. And I just could not believe that that was happening in the modern age, and it felt just like slavery. And the more Cheryl and I began to report on these issues, the more we came to see them in a new light and to develop two central themes. The first is that just as in the 19th century, the central moral challenge of the world was slavery, and in the 20th century, the central moral challenge was totalitarianism. In this century, we really believe that the paramount moral challenge is the oppression that is the lot of so many women and girls all around the world. Now, when we say that, I think people sometimes perceive that as hyperbole, as spin, as an exaggeration to get people's attention. And it's really not. It really isn't. It's absolutely how we see it. One reason why has to do with the fact, and let me turn the tables on you and ask you about this. Are there more males or females in the world today? Let's actually have a show of hands here. Let's put you on the spot. If you think there are more males in the world today, can you raise your hand? And if you think there are more females in the world today, can you raise your hand? I'm actually afraid the first group was right. The first group of about 3 people. There are more males in the world today. There are more females in the United States. There are more females in Europe. There are definitely more females in this room. And given equal access to food and health care, women live longer. In an egalitarian world, there would be more females. But the point is that this is not an egalitarian world, and that in much of the world, this gender discrimination is lethal. The upshot of that, and also of sex-selective abortion, is that you have between 50 and 110 million women who are missing around the globe. That is why there are more males than females worldwide. And just one way to slice and dice those statistics is that in any 10-year period, more females are discriminated against to death than all the people who were killed in all the genocides of the 20th century. It's just a stunning figure. And when you think of it in those terms, it's hard, I think, to see why this would not be the central moral challenge of the century. But the other theme that became increasingly apparent to us is that putting aside all the injustices, if you simply look at how you can most cost-effectively address so many of the great challenges of this century, whether it be global poverty, whether it be carbon emissions linked to climate change, whether it be social conflict, terrorism, then so often, I mean, there are no silver bullets here. Nothing works as well as we might hope. But typically, the most cost-effective intervention is going to be to invest in girls' education, to bring educated women into the formal labor force, to attend to their health, and watch a virtuous spiral unfold that ends up benefiting men every bit as much as women. And that is why we argue, indeed, that we shouldn't see women and girls as the problem, but as the solution. And since the events of Sunday with the capture of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, it's maybe noteworthy to just divert for a moment and think about Pakistan and Afghanistan in that context. I think that sometimes we sort of psych ourselves out and think that discrimination against women and girls is deeply embedded in a culture and that one really can't do very much about it. And it's true that that is a challenge. But until 1971, of course, Bangladesh was a part of Pakistan. And when Bangladesh became independent in 1971, it had very little going for it. It was incredibly poor. It was famously described by Henry Kissinger as an international basket case. The one thing that it really did do was invest in girls' education. Today in Bangladesh, there are more girls in high school than boys. And it still obviously has enormous problems ahead. But the result of all those educated girls was that they began to fill civil society, organizations like Grameen, like BRAC, work on public health issues. And they also began to enter the formal economy. And all those garment factories producing shirts for the American economy gave a new dynamism to Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, we don't see the same degree, by any means, of social conflict, of terrorism. In Pakistan, on the other hand, girls' education and women more broadly truly have been neglected, especially since the 1970s and President Zia ul-Haq. And the upshot is that in the tribal areas that are most noted for conflict, you have only 3% female literacy. It seems to me that one lesson, and we see this in many other areas as well, Yemen would be a good example, is that while there are there's no simple toolbox for the kinds of problems that present us in Pakistan, Afghanistan, that focusing more on investing in girls, bringing those educated women into the labor force is an important element that we need to address more fully. And it always horrifies me that since 9/11 we spent close to $20 billion in Pakistan, essentially supporting the Pakistan military, which now it seems elements of may have indeed harbored Osama. And on the other hand, we have done almost nothing to promote education in Pakistan, especially girls' education in Pakistan, or women's health, or this effort to broaden society there. And over that time period, 10 years, I think we actually would be beginning to get some returns if we were relying on that kind of a toolbox. And the trade-offs are enormous. For the price of one American soldier in Afghanistan for 1 year, you can start about 20 schools and endow them for the first 3 years of operating costs. Well, I also want to offer a couple of caveats. I think that there's, that while it's very important to focus on women in urban areas because that is the future, that is where increasingly the women are, I think we should be wary of thinking that the problems in the urban areas are necessarily worse than the problems in rural areas. The problem is that women in rural areas face enormous challenges. Women in urban areas face enormous challenges. They're somewhat different challenges. Education is somewhat easier to deliver in an urban area. On the other hand, in an urban setting, you have people who are plucked out of their support network. The hierarchies that you can work through tend to be shattered, the traditional hierarchies. And there also tend to be problems of insecurity and danger and sexual violence. So the problems are different, but not necessarily heightened. And the other thing that I think we need to be wary of is that when one focuses on all the terrible things that happen to women around the world, there's a tendency sometimes to think that the basic problem is men. And maybe, as one of the few men here, I'm just feeling defensive. But one of the things that really does strike me after reporting on this so much is that I think that that is simplistic, and it has struck me so often that the notion of some kind of global female solidarity is hugely overdone, and that so many of the terrible things that happen to women all over the world happen at the hands of fellow women. Most of the human traffickers around the world are women. Most of the people who decide to cut a girl's genitals are the mothers. In India, vaccination decisions are made by mothers, and a mother is only half as likely to vaccinate her daughter as to vaccinate her son. So, and the other side of that is that if we want to elevate this issue on the agenda and get more resources and get more attention to it, then it's very important that this not just be considered a women's issue, because that will immediately marginalize it. And at the end of the day, you know, the Holocaust wasn't just a Jewish issue, civil rights weren't just a black issue, and when you have somewhere around 50 to 120 million women missing around the globe, that's not just a women's issue. It's a vast human rights issue that concerns men as well as women, and we need to form a united front to address them. A few key issues that I think need to be very high on some kind of an agenda focusing on women's health in urban settings. One that is very near and dear to my heart is the notion of human trafficking, which really is a modern form of slavery. In fact, there are a couple of differences that are illuminating. One has to do with scale. The peak of the transatlantic slave trade was actually back in the 1780s, when you had just under 80,000 slaves a year transported from Africa to the New World, just under 80,000. These days, the numbers are somewhat disputed, but it appears that about 800,000 people are transported across international borders each year, are trafficked across those borders. And that does not even include those who are trafficked within a country, which is a common form of trafficking. I mean, the scale, in other words, is greater than at the peak of transatlantic slavery. And another difference has to do with the value, if you will, the commercial value of somebody who has been trafficked. One thing that protected slaves in the early 19th century was that they were valuable to their owners, and the owners did not want them to die for that reason. In the 1840s, a healthy young slave was worth, in today's money, about 40,000 US dollars. In contrast, you can buy a girl in a brothel in India, in Pakistan, in Cambodia, in Malaysia, for a few $100s. And as a result, they become disposable. And that is indeed why brothel owners in those countries will periodically kill girls who are uncooperative. Some of you may know that in 2004, I did something that raised a lot of eyebrows in journalistic circles. I ended up buying two girls from their brothels in Cambodia. One I paid just over one I paid $150 for, and the other just over $200 for. And the thing that maybe shook me the most was that I got receipts. When you get a receipt for buying a human being in the 21st century, that really should be a disgrace on this age. And in working with them after, I took them, I worked with a Cambodian NGO, took them back to their home villages and set them up in small businesses, and we had a series of upheavals. One tended to work out, one was resettled quite well. The other one ended up, a few days later, running back to the brothel. She turned out to be addicted to methamphetamines, and she got her meth from the brothel. And we tried a couple more times to get her out. Each time, she desperately wanted to start a new life, but she also had this incredible craving for meth, and she couldn't get over it. And so I thought that this was hopeless, that she was going to end up dying in that brothel. And I think that, indeed, one of the challenges with human trafficking more broadly is that we kind of give up, that we think that prostitution is the world's oldest profession. It's unfortunate, it's tragic, but it's just indelibly a part of life. And the truth is that my experiences really have taught me that we can make real progress on this. It may well be that 1,000 years from now there will still be prostitution, but you don't have to have a situation where you have 14-year-old girls kidnapped and locked up in cages. And in this case, this girl who ran back to the brothel repeatedly, after I'd given up on her, there was in fact some further movement, and it turned out that because various journalists, including me, were writing articles about the problem in Cambodia, the government began to get a little bit embarrassed. And because also the US government was doing an annual trafficking in persons report that embarrassed the Cambodian government, the government began to send word through the National Police Force to try to clamp down a little bit. Now, they did not actually close down the brothels. They did not actually arrest the trafficker in this case. But they did begin to demand more and more in bribes. The upshot was that the trafficker in this case who ran that brothel, she's a businesswoman. She was just trying to make money the best way she could. And with there being these increasing demands for bribes, she just found that it wasn't worth her while anymore running a brothel. She closed the brothel and turned it into a grocery store. And this girl in question, Sreemam, then was able to leave the brothel, married a policeman who had been a customer, probably because if you want to get a steady supply of meth in Poipat, Cambodia, then a policeman is a good source of it. It's not an ideal solution in any ways, but it was a reminder that one really can chip away at these problems and make progress, and that we shouldn't just accept realities as they are. We can change those realities. I think it's also important to remember that issues like trafficking are not only a problem of urban settings in places like Cambodia or India, Pakistan, but also very much here in the US. And it's true that the atrocities involved in trafficking tend not to be quite as horrific in the US as they are in some of those other countries, but they are still enormous. And we can't begin to talk credibly to other countries about their problems unless we do more to clean up our own act. I think we also tend to have a misunderstanding, misapprehension about the nature of trafficking in this country. We tend to think that it involves just foreign women being smuggled into the US. That is indeed one element of it. But I tend to think that the biggest part of it, and also truly the worst part, especially in terms of the age of the girls involved, has to do with domestic, American-grown girls who run away from home and ended up under the control of these pimps. It typically is a girl from a troubled home, maybe a rebellious girl who's on difficult terms with her mom, then her mom's boyfriend hits on her. At 13, she runs away to the bus station, and the only person on the lookout for girls like her at the bus station is the pimp. And the notion that a pimp is a business partner of these girls is a complete misunderstanding of that relationship. Every penny that the girl earns, every penny, there's no 50-50 split. Every penny, 100% goes to the pimp. She is completely under his control. And it is incredibly aggravating when prosecutors and police then go and arrest those 14-year-old girls and send them to juvenile detention and let the pimps go and let the Johns go. We need to change our law enforcement approach and in particular go after those pimps. They are just as subject to incentives as that Cambodian brothel owner that I mentioned. We can change their setting and get them to steal cars instead or do whatever else. We can change their motivations. Well, another issue that I think has to be really high on the global agenda as we look at women's health in cities is reproductive health generally. And this is one, frankly, that is to some degree in a budget crisis right now. It was one that I was reporting on last week in Somalia. Maternal mortality and maternal health is one that has particularly galvanized me in the course of my reporting to come across women who die incredibly needlessly in childbirth when we know exactly how to save those lives. But the problem is that they have 3 strikes against them. They're poor, and they're female, and they just are not on the agenda of that country. And in addition to the maternal death, in Somalia, 1 woman in 10 will end up dying in childbirth. 1 woman in 10 in her lifetime risk of death in childbirth. For every woman who dies, you have about 20 who are injured in childbirth. And I've seen a lot of really wrenching things in my travels, but maybe the thing that is just about more heartbreaking than anything else is an obstetric fistula. And I'm sure many of you know about them. Typically, it's a childbirth injury that very often occurs to a girl whose pelvis isn't fully formed, isn't ready to have a baby. There's no doctor around. The baby gets stuck. The baby dies. She suffers internal injuries that leave her incontinent. She's leaking waste. She smells. She often has foot drops, so that nerve damage in her legs, so that she can't walk. And her life is effectively over unless she can get surgical help. One of the people who most moved me is an Ethiopian girl, Mahabuba, who was married at age 13 to a man in his 50s. Promptly got pregnant, delivered at 14 in the bush by herself, suffered a fistula. Because she was stinking, to be blunt about it, the folks there put her in a hut and took off the door so the hyenas would get her that night. She's unbelievably strong, unbelievably resilient, unbelievably courageous. There was a stick there in the hut, and all night she waved it around her head and shouted at the hyenas to keep them away. At dawn, she knew that there was a American missionary who lived about 30 miles away. She set off, because she couldn't walk, she set off crawling to get to him. Finally arrived half dead on his doorstep, and he could immediately tell from the smell that she had a fistula. I took her to the Addis Ababa Fistula Hospital in the capital of Ethiopia, and she got a $350 surgery that gave her life back. And I was once telling the story of this girl, Mahabuba, and one of the people in the audience was an OBGYN named Steve Arrowsmith, an American, and it turned out that Steve had been the one who had repaired that fistula. And he remembered Mahabuba very well. And the aftermath of it was that when she was recovering from that operation, she was in the hospital, so the staff asked her to sort of help out with odds and ends, and they realized she's incredibly bright. And they asked her to help out more and more, and she's now a nurse at that hospital. It's just a reminder that, what we're dealing here is not just tragedies, but also opportunities. We can take these people who were squandered assets and turn them into productive resources for their families, their communities, and their countries. If we're going to make progress on issues like maternal mortality, though, we have to also think about other aspects of reproductive health, and one of those has to be family planning. You can't, if you can reduce the number of pregnancies in some of these countries by half, you're going to reduce the number of maternal deaths by at least half. In Somalia, one of the families that I talked to that had just lost a mother of 8, there had been no family planning anywhere around. It was completely unavailable. And the nurse at the local health post said that if she had condoms, if she had injectables, then at least some people would use them, would take them. but there was absolutely nothing available. And use of modern contraceptives there is about 1%. We can do an awful lot better, and it was so discouraging to see support for international family planning assistance slashed in the latest budget compromise after another effort to reduce it to zero. But meanwhile, there was one element of one family planning program that did get through Congress this spring. Anybody know what it was? It was a little obscure. It was sponsored by Dan Burton, the Republican congressman, passed unanimously on a voice vote. It was contraception for wild horses in BLM lands in the West. And what do you say when Congress provides contraception for wild horses but slashes contraception for human beings? It is just heartbreaking. And the upshot of that is going to be more lives lost. The other aspect of reproductive health that I was reporting on in Somalia is FGM. You know, one of the great global human rights challenges. About 3 million girls a year in Africa alone have their genitals cut. And this is something that the mothers are essentially deciding. Essentially, fathers are out of that decision-making. And this, since the 1970s, you've had a major international effort to end FGM that has essentially accomplished almost nothing. In the country of Guinea, which I visited recently, FGM is now punishable by life imprisonment, and yet 99% of girls are still cut. In Somalia, what was kind of heartbreaking was the discovery that people have found that because there are campaigns against the kind of cutting that goes on in Somalia, it's called infibulation. It's the most extreme kind. That because that campaign has gotten nowhere, that they have essentially changed their strategy, and now they're urging parents, mothers, to go ahead and continue to cut their daughters, but to use a milder form of FGM, because that will save lives, both from infections at the time and much later from childbirth. And I mean, frankly, it makes sense. They made a convincing case that they're going to save more lives if they do that. But of course, it's not a very cheery, exciting message from an NGO that, boy, we're convincing mothers to cut their daughters in a less brutal way. But it's a harsh reality that is out there. There are a couple of ways in which we sometimes psych ourselves out from this. And of course, for Cheryl and me, and for this conference, the aim isn't just to inform, it's really to galvanize people, to get people involved. One of the things that I found exciting in talking to people about how things are going was how excited people were to go out and do something, not just feel enlightened. And you know, that really is the test of whether this event is going to be a success, not whether you feel more educated, whether you go and do something. And you've had a lot of ideas that you've heard earlier. We started a website called halftheskymovement.org that lists a bunch of great organizations. In the back of Half the Sky, we list some great organizations as well that are doing really good work. But there are a couple of ways in which we psych ourselves out, I think. And one is the question of, does it make a difference? And I fear, actually, that the latest uproar over Greg Mortensen is going to add to those kinds of doubts. And the truth is that, you know, those doubts are legitimate. And I sometimes think that humanitarian organizations overpromise how easy it is to bring about change. The truth is, it's harder to help people than it looks. And I think it is worth acknowledging. Anybody who has traveled around the developing world has seen a lot of projects that have not gone as planned. Right now, we're seeing in Andhra Pradesh in India something of a backlash against microfinance. And I think part of it was that the success of microfinance brought in more players, including for-profit players who weren't as good. But I also think that some of that is because people in this space if you really believe in something, then it becomes very easy to, especially when you're fundraising, to exaggerate how easy it is to make an impact. And it's hard. The real problem is with corruption. In Chad, there was a study of money that was intended for rural health clinics, and for every dollar that was allocated, only 3 cents actually reached those clinics. These are real problems. But I guess my response to that is that while those problems are real, anybody who has traveled in the developing world has also seen extraordinary examples of programs that have had an amazing impact. And I think we're getting better at figuring out what kinds of interventions work. And that's one reason why the research that is going to come out of your work is so important, because there have been real strides and better research, and the latest sort of exciting development in research has been randomized controlled experiments where you it's the equivalent of double-blind experiments with pharmaceuticals, but you assign different areas randomly to a control group and an intervention group, and you see what works. And some of the lessons have been really fascinating. For example, to get more kids in school, it turns out that the most cost-effective way of doing that costs only $3 to get 1 more year of schooling, is something we would never think of. You know what it is? Deworming. We don't think of deworming because none of us have worms. Most kids in much of the developing world have intestinal worms. And this is a particular problem for girls, because after they begin menstruating, they're already anemic, they're more likely to be anemic, and those intestinal worms will add to that anemia. They're going to be weaker, they're going to be sicker, they're going to be more likely to miss school. And you can deworm a child with 1 pill of albendazole. It's a simple medicine. It'll deworm a child for about a year. It costs about 20 cents. And it has a very, very dramatic effect on school attendance. So we're getting smarter about what kinds of interventions work. And that is really making a difference. And I guess the other thing I would say about making a difference is that I think in the past, we sometimes thought that the way of making a difference is solving a problem, and we sometimes aim to change international architecture and develop new covenants, pass laws. That approach hasn't always worked really well. Increasingly, I've been a believer in the approach that seems to be gaining more traction now, which is, while still pushing for top-down efforts, also do bottom-up efforts. Start a school, start a clinic, start a deworming initiative somewhere. And it may not solve the global problem, but if you can deworm the kids in a particular school, in a particular refugee camp, then whether or not it solves the global problem, for those kids, it may well be transformational. And the story there that, it's so hokey that I'm embarrassed to say it, but it's the Hawaiian parable of the starfish that have washed up on the sea. Do you know this? A boy is walking along the seashore in Hawaii, and the starfish are washed up, and he's throwing the starfish back. And a man comes up and says, "What are you doing? There are millions of starfish. You can't make a difference." And the boy just reaches down and pulls up another one, throws it back in the sea, and says, "Well, it sure made a difference to that one." And that's truly exactly what anybody can do for just stunningly small amounts of money. The final way in which we psych ourselves out, I guess, has to do with the question of why should I care? And maybe especially at a time of economic difficulties, we're feeling the pinch. We tend to look after our own needs, and it becomes easier to tune out those of other people, whether at home or abroad. And I guess part of the answer to why should I care is that if you've actually encountered some of these people, if you've actually encountered a girl who's dropped out of school for one of $10 in annual fees, then you don't ask that question. If you've met a girl in a brothel who's locked up there and is going to die of AIDS, you don't ask that question. But the other answer to that is that one of the things we're learning is that while our efforts to help other people frankly, have a somewhat mixed record, they have an almost perfect record of helping ourselves. And one of the things that Cheryl and I really learned in writing Half the Sky was we wrote about needs abroad, but we also wrote about groups of Americans who were working together to try to start various initiatives to help. And typically they would start feeling, oh boy, this is a burden, this is a sacrifice, we've got so much to do. But when they got more engaged, and especially when it went beyond writing checks to actually doing something, then they began to feel they were not only empowering people halfway around the world or on the wrong side of the tracks in their city, but truly empowering themselves. And it's also one of the lessons of neurology and social psychology over the last 15 years or so about what makes us happy. Answers are very complex, and actually some interesting work on this has been done at UPenn. But one of the answers to that question that seems to make a difference in our happiness level is connecting to some cause larger than ourselves. And that's what we're talking about today. And it also offers a new perspective on our own lives. Let me just leave you with the story of a friend of mine, a young American woman who was an aid worker in Sudan, in Darfur. I met her in Sudan. She was unbelievably tough there. She saw things that nobody should ever have to see. Worked with women in particular, and was unbelievably strong and courageous, never flinched. Then she came back over Christmas vacation here to the US. She's in her grandmother's backyard. She totally lost it. You know what it was? Her grandmother had set up a bird feeder in the backyard. My friend was there thinking about how she'd just come from a place where babies were being thrown onto bonfires because of the color of their skin and the tribe they belonged to. And she thought how she had the incredible good fortune to be born and grow up in a country where we take security pretty much for granted, where we have the wealth pretty much not only to feed and clothe and house ourselves, but to help wild birds get through the winter. And she just thought about that and her good luck and the responsibility that comes with it in a new way, and that's when she lost it. And in the same way, all of us here, the fact that we are here means that we truly have won the lottery of life. And the question becomes how one goes about discharging that responsibility. This cause, in one of its many, many manifestations, some element of it that appeals to you, and in the course of that, I think you will find yourself just a little bit happier, more fulfilled, gain a little bit of perspective, and help change the world just a little bit. Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you very much. You're embarrassing me.
You're inspiring. You're inspiring with your pen, and you're inspiring in person. And I think you are calling us to action here. And there are maybe a couple of questions. And there are also a microphone if you would like to ask a question. But I'll start with this question that came from you. We talked a lot about human trafficking, and you have done the same, Mr. Kristof. It's a huge issue in the United States. It largely has gone unnoticed by healthcare providers. How we think, when we think of trafficking, we think it's somewhere else. We don't think that it is right in our backyard here in New York. Who should point this out? Who is best situated to locate and treat the victims? They are basically invisible in our healthcare system, and they are invisible in our city. This is a group here that has been really talking about action. What can we do? I think they are inspired. So I think it would be really helpful to hear from you on that.
Well, I think we are getting a better sense of what works, and there are a lot of different interventions. There's no silver bullet, but in a sense there is silver buckshot that can address it. And it's not going to solve the problem, but it can make a real difference. among the interventions that do seem to make a difference, one is much more aggressive law enforcement against the pimps, as I mentioned earlier. And some jurisdictions are beginning to make progress on that, including New York City. New York City seems also interested in emulating what is called the Swedish model, which is also the model that is getting traction in Europe and seems to be, I mean, when I started looking into this, I was sympathetic to a sort of legalize and regulate model on the basis that then you can at least get public health access to girls in the business and prevent underage trafficking. In fact, the legalize and regulate model has not worked very well. It tends to create a parallel market in underage girls. And the Swedish model of treating those in prostitution as victims getting social services and treating those purchasing sex as the criminal offenders, that seems actually to work much better, and that then reduces, because it reduces demand, it reduces the price of commercial sex, which reduces the incentive to traffic people into it. So I'd love to see jurisdictions in the US move toward the Swedish model. Some jurisdictions, including San Francisco, have experimented with the John schools, where Johns are sentenced to have a sort of day of education in which girls who have been trafficked speak to them. And I think that that seems to have an impact, that they typically think that these girls are there completely voluntarily, and when they actually hear the stories, they get pretty shaken. They see it in a different light. And there are a lot of other steps that groups are working on, but I'd say that part of it is pressure on on district attorneys, on prosecutors, on politicians to change the way we prosecute and go after pimps in particular.
Thank you. You have been traveling recently to many parts of the world that had revolutions for democracy. Could you talk a little bit about what's happening to women in those revolutions, and do you have any concerns about their voice?
In the various Middle East revolutions, women, it seems to me, were actually more of a presence, I think, than most Americans believed. And part of it is that our view of what is happening tends to be framed by television imagery, and television images always end up focusing on rocks being thrown back and forth or people being clubbed. And it's true that the women were somewhat less involved in the rock throwing than the men, but they were out there on the streets. And whether it was in Cairo and Tahrir Square, whether it was in Bahrain, I remember in Bahrain seeing these just unbelievably brave women marching toward the police and soldiers who a day earlier had opened fire and killed some of these protesters. And those women marched down the street right toward them. I thought I was going to watch a massacre. They showed unbelievable courage. Now, where this goes, I don't know. Americans tended to be very concerned that in countries like Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood was going to end up as the victor and that women would end up worse off. That was not the view of those women out there protesting, and I tend to think that that is likewise not the case. I think that, I think it would be a real mistake to bet against democracy in any of these places, and and they really did play a much more significant role than I think a lot of people in this country think.
So, one last question. What starfish example can you give each one of us to leave here today with so we can make a difference in the world?
There are so many interventions that that really matter. But I think maybe if I had to, if you really forced me to pick, I might pick education and girls' education as the single thing that affects so many dimensions of life, that it improves when that girl is an adult, she is going to raise her own children better. Her offspring are going to be more likely to survive. We tend to think of family planning and contraception, often in terms of injectables or the pill or whatever else. The most, in many ways, the most effective form of contraception is girls' education. You educate a boy, it has a modest effect on his family size. You educate a girl, it has a dramatic effect on the number of children she will have. It has an extraordinary effect. And it also means that she will generate more income as she's educated. And there's also pretty good evidence that when you educate that when a woman generates income, and this research is utterly demoralizing if you're a man, that women, when they generate income or when they have control over assets, that money is going to be more likely to be used to start small businesses or to support children's education. Yet only 1% of the world's property is actually titled to women. And educating girls addresses so many of these aspects. And one starfish example there is a girl in Uganda. Her name is Betty, short for Beatrice, Betty Bira. And she grew up there, was not sent to school by her parents because she was a girl. Her parents thought, oh, she's a girl, she can fetch water, she can fetch firewood, she can look after her siblings. And then when she was 9 and had already missed 3 years of school, her parents got a goat through Heifer International. I'm sure you know Heifer. There's a church in Connecticut. They got 6 goats one Christmas, and one of those goats ended up in the hands of Beatrice's parents. They sold the milk from the goat, and I think got a bit of a nudge from Heifer, and used that milk money to pay Betty's school fees. She rocketed to the top of her class, stayed at the top of her class all during elementary school. In middle school and high school, began to do really well in nationwide exams, and then became the first person in her village to go abroad to study. Graduated from Connecticut College, and is today working on global girls' education in the developing world. And to me, and at her graduation party at Connecticut College, she pronounced herself the luckiest girl in the world and said, "It's all because of a goat."
Thank you so much.